Hello everyone and welcome to Beyond COVID, the show that takes a step back from the corona crisis to ask, what is it teaching us about how we all live? How can we build back better after the crisis? And what opportunities does it provide to do things differently, or will we just return to business as usual? My name's Jennifer Nadel and my co-host is
Matt Hawkins, and today we are honoured that the MP for Brighton Pavilion, Caroline Lucas, has joined us on the show. Caroline has been a Green Party MP since 2010 when she made history by becoming Britain's first Green Member of Parliament. She has also, of course, been the party's leader and has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Observer's Politician of the Year 3 times over, and was named by The Guardian as one of the 50 people who could save the planet. No pressure there, Caroline. How are you managing in the lockdown?
Thanks very much. That's a very kind introduction, and it's great to be with you. I can't tell you how busy it is right now in terms of the number of people contacting my office, and I know it's the same for MPs up and down the country. And it just brings home, really, I think, just how so many people were living so close to the edge anyway, and that this crisis is the thing that's pushed them over. And there's just so much worry about people's businesses, people's livelihoods, whether they're going to have a job. Worried about what's happening with the NHS, worried about social care and care homes in particular. So it's been a really massively stressful time for everybody, and I think our office kind of has a sort of insight into what it's like for so many people.
And obviously with your front row seat, very much trying to do everything you can to ameliorate some of the suffering that's being caused by this crisis. What do you wish we were doing differently?
I wish we had been in a better position before we started having to deal with this crisis, because I think what COVID has shown us is just how run down our public services have allowed to be. That after 10 years of austerity, the infrastructure in our society was so lacking in resilience that it's just meant that it's taken us longer to get up and running to try to cope with the crisis in so many different ways. And I think it's just shone a real spotlight on what 10 years of austerity does to the public sector. So I wish that we were starting off with this with an NHS that had far greater resilience, far greater capacity, that hadn't had the fragmentation which the Health and Social Care Act, Andrew Lansley's famous act, had brought in some years ago. I wish that we had had a thriving workforce rather than, an attitude towards low-paid staff, NHS staff, migrants that was basically about not treating them well, and therefore we've basically been in a really poor position to start dealing with this crisis. So my thanks, along with everybody else's, goes to everybody on the front line of this, whether that's in social care, the NHS, whether they're people stacking the shelves in the supermarkets, whether they're the people who are doing the deliveries which still keep our society going. What I wish is that we had valued those people from the start, and that we had recognized from the start just how vital they are to our society.
Caroline, you were talking there about some of the huge changes that we have already seen since COVID began to spread. And we know that when there have been other crises, those too have led to huge amounts of change. So the financial crash in 2008 led to austerity. The attacks on 9/11 led to the war on terror. How do we ensure that the changes that come out as a result of COVID are for the better?
I think what we need to do is to make sure that the interventions that are happening now are building a greener and fairer society that absolutely has to come out the other end of this. I think it's vital to recognize that, much as people kind of want to go back to normal, as it were, and that's entirely understandable, actually normal in terms of business as usual, wasn't delivering for the vast majority of people over the vast majority of time. An economy that's been focused on the extraction of profit and endless growth has eroded our collective immune system, if you like, by undermining, underfunding social care and healthcare, impoverishing people here and around the world, and destroying climate and nature. But if we choose to, I think we can lay the groundwork now for a different kind of society. And that would mean things like when the airline industries go cap in hand to the government to say, please bail us out, we make very clear that there are absolutely no bailouts unless and until aviation in that example begins to bring its strategy in line with climate constraints, and until it shows how it is going to massively reduce its emissions. And frankly, that's going to mean less aviation into the future. Or it means something as simple as when we're talking about how important it is to make sure that children who have had free school meals, there's been a big debate to make sure that they continue to have food vouchers over the Easter holidays. And I'm really glad the government's agreed to do that. But why have we set up a system whereby those vouchers are only redeemable in the big supermarkets? Why could we not have had those redeemable in local small shops, which are going to be the backbone of a more resilient set of local economies? So I think it's about trying to build back better, to use the phrase that many people are using, but literally to make sure that the decisions that we're making now are ones that are more likely to embed social justice and environmental sustainability into the society that we need to see coming out the other end.
And in Westminster, is there any cross-party planning that is happening along those lines? Obviously, we've seen a lot of cohesion and support for the government's response, but is there a coherent and cohesive response across parties to how we build back better after the crisis?
I mean, certainly those discussions are happening. I have to say, my experience of them has been that they have been the opposition parties as a whole rather than the government party, but certainly there are fora where that's happening. So, for example, there's a very active group now, cross-party, talking about universal basic income, and recognising that, in a sense, what this crisis has shown us, again, is just how fragile our social welfare system is, and how unfit for purpose universal credit is for being able to respond to people who are in sudden and deep need. This idea that you're going to have to wait for 5 weeks and you had to make special arrangements if you wanted money before that. It's very clear that over the next, I don't know how many months it will be, but months and maybe years, as we come to terms with recovering from this moment, people will be going in and out of employment in a far more rapid way than our current welfare system can possibly keep up with. It's struggling even now. And any change of circumstance that people have, it really struggles to keep up with that. So the idea that that system can possibly take us forward into the future, I think is really shown to be wrong. So a universal basic income would be a way of ensuring that everybody has that bedrock of economic security. And so there are, very exciting discussions going on, admittedly so far between the opposition parties, but we're trying to find Conservatives who might support this. And interestingly, actually, as a sign of the times, Edward Lee, a long-standing Conservative, stood up in Parliament just before the lockdown and said, this is the time for a universal basic income. So, so strange things happen. That debate is happening. Another debate is happening around a Green New Deal. Clive Lewis from the Labour Party and myself are the co-chairs of an all-party parliamentary group that we're trying to get up and running on a Green New Deal. And that has traditionally been about thinking how we can make a massive investment in the green economic sector, how we can use this moment as a way of addressing inequality as well as sustainability. And we're broadening that out now as well, obviously, to look at the lessons from COVID and to really see how do we capture the political will that has been shown now for this crisis to continue on into the much bigger crisis of climate. Because, at a moment when the government can just literally strike off £13 billion of NHS debt in a twinkling of an eye, and it was just a footnote of a day when so much else had already happened, when something as big as that can happen overnight, when industries can be renationalised, when we really see that any sense that austerity was anything other than a political choice is completely gone. It's always been clear that the last 10 years of austerity was a political choice, but now the government's showing it. Now you've got Michael Gove saying protecting the vulnerable people is the most important thing. So I think what this whole crisis has shown us is that our definition of what is politically possible has to be an awful lot wider and bigger than we ever imagined before. And that potentially is one good thing that could come out of what is otherwise obviously just such a nightmare for so many people right now.
So Caroline, some recent polling that we haven't yet released shows that half the population would support the government in using the kind of measures that we've seen to tackle the COVID crisis being applied to the climate crisis, and only 28% of voters said they didn't want the government to take that kind of extreme action. What's your response to that?
I think those polling figures are really exciting, because if you've only got 28% of people saying that they don't think these measures are appropriate, then that, I think, is a pretty big green light to say governments should be far more ambitious when it comes to tackling the climate crisis than they've ever dreamed of being before. All too often you get the sense that they won't do what they know they should do because they're concerned about how the public would respond to it. I think this polling shows that, yet again, the public are far ahead of the politicians, and that if they can have faith in the idea that the politicians really are putting in place a clear strategy with clear tactics along the way, then they can bring the public with them, and we can then, I think, get ourselves onto a much safer course when it comes to climate than we're currently on. So I'm very excited by this polling, and I hope it really will be a spur to more action on climate.
What do you think, Caroline, about the fact that people have been ahead of the government on this? What can we do now to also build that back into the system so that we can have a properly people-led politics in the future?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things that has happened in all of the awfulness has been the recognition that actually human beings, by and large, are far more social creatures. We are far more compassionate. We are, that we have much greater innate kindness than different systems would ever give credit for. And maybe people themselves have begun to believe that we are these individualistic, competitive units of consumption that we are kind of, told that we are by the dominant economic system. And this realization that actually the vast majority of people are really looking out for their neighbours and for each other, and that those mutual aid groups got off the mark, far quicker than anything the government could have done. And I think the real challenge now is to make sure that, as the state does move in, and I'm very pleased that they've got their new system for people to help out with supporting communities, but we must make sure that it's not done in a top-down way that smothers what has been such an important flourishing of those new, in some cases, local community groups. And so, the level of micro development that's been happening, literally street by street, there's been something extraordinary going on. And I've heard stories of, older people literally in tears because they hadn't known the people in their street before, and this has been the first time someone's knocked on their door. And maybe that's also not been a criticism of other people. It's just like, people almost need a reason, an excuse to go and do what they actually want to do, which is to reach out to people. So I think the challenge, to try to answer your question going forward, is to make sure that the processes going forward are bottom up, and that we find fora, and I don't know quite how citizens' assemblies move online if they need to, but that kind of idea, we've got to make sure that this, amazing flourishing of community spirit is something that is harnessed and used, not something that inadvertently or deliberately is somehow clamped down on from on top.
So one of the cruel ironies of this crisis, of course, is that it's forced us to take the very measures that environmentalists have long called for, although of course you wouldn't want it to happen in this way. We are seeing a drop in emissions and pollution decreasing.
I mean, I think that's right, that the changes that those of us in the green movement have been calling for so long, by definition need to be intentional and democratic and inclusive. No one would have wanted them to have come about in the way that they've been forced on us by this horrible pandemic. But as you say, there are some things now that people are recognizing that they had lost. I mean, that sense of, a cleaner, greener environment. And hopefully, I think that people now recognizing just how important it is, for example, to have access to green space, that is something that will continue after the lockdown has finished, and to capture those things that people suddenly recognize they really need, like green space. Who would have thought that necessarily there would have been such an outcry when some of the parks were closed? And in a way, it's great that there was that outcry, because it just demonstrates that people's mental health and their physical well-being massively depend on having access to nature, to green spaces and so on. And I think we've seen that writ large. And so, just to re-emphasize again, nobody would have wanted it to come about in this way. But to the extent that it's given us an opportunity to rethink what we really value, and to the extent that nature is such a vitally important part of that, then I think that is something that we can build on into the future.
Thank you.
Caroline, just thinking about the global response and the difference between countries and how they've dealt with COVID. Some people have pointed out that perhaps those nations which have been a bit more effective, we could say, and more compassionate in the way they've communicated about COVID to their population, the thing that they have in common is female leadership. Do you think that a lack of female leadership has made a difference to the way that Britain has dealt with it?
I think that's a really hard question. You know, if Theresa May was still Prime Minister, would we have had a better response? I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say that I think that we would. I would say, though, that I've been really struck, and I know others have too, by just the way in which when a crisis happens, any women who were on the front bench have just seemed to have disappeared. I mean, over and over again, if you look at those press conferences and so forth, when it comes to the politicians at least, they are all the men. So I've been very mindful of that. It's been an interesting phenomenon, and I don't know how much of that is deliberate or who knows. But I do think that having, you know, a diverse set of voices speaking to the population means that you've got to have a better chance of some of those messages landing in a way that speaks to everybody in our society. So that much I certainly would agree with.
Bit of a change of pace now, Caroline, and a little bit more personal. What's the one thing that you are really struggling with most about the lockdown?
Oh, it is being able to give friends a hug. I mean, it's as basic as that. To be more personal still, my dad very sadly died about 6 weeks ago, and I feel terrible for my mum. You know, they were married 69 years and hardly a night apart, and it feels incredibly cruel not to be able to go and see my mum right now. You know, and it's not just me who can't see her, but you know, none of the family can see her, and that feels really, really hard.
Oh, yeah, that is hard. I'm sorry to hear that, Caroline. Do you have a sort of comfort that you have at home at the moment that's helping you both obviously deal with the pain and stress that's caused, but also the surrounding stress that we're living through?
You mean other than gin and chocolate?
Yeah, I think they're a given, aren't they now?
I mean, at the minute it's been so full on right now, just in terms of work volume. But when I get a chance to sort of, I mean, I do feel massively blessed to have a garden, and just being able to get outside is so important. And that's why I feel so passionately about making sure that we don't end up closing parks. And there's a national campaign to try to open golf courses if necessary, if that was something that would give people greater access to green space. And I've come under quite a lot of attack from the golfing community for suggesting it. But I just think that everybody needs that bit of peace that you might be able to find by being out in nature. And it's so hard for so many families who just don't have that, and they should have it. And I hope that one of the things, going back to our earlier discussion about what do we need to learn from this, I hope one of the things we can learn from it is that in new developments, every development should have easy access to green space.
Caroline, if you could leave our listeners with one takeaway message or action, what would it be?
If you haven't already, knocked on the doors of people close by you, and then obviously run back down to the bottom of the path, because you shouldn't be too close to them, but nonetheless reaching out in whatever way, a note under the door or a phone call or something, then please do. I think it's just been, you know, the one silver lining to an awful time is just recognizing that human beings are deeply, deeply social. We get our meaning from our relationships, and we get our sense of self-worth through those relationships as well. And reaching out, maybe phoning up somebody that you've not spoken to for years, just use this time to rekindle some of those relationships that in our all too busy lives are all too easy to not nurture. This is a time to nurture those, I think.
A huge thank you, Caroline Lucas, for taking the time out to talk to us at the Beyond COVID podcast. And next time, we'll be talking to Professor Alice Roberts, medical doctor, human anthropologist, and BBC presenter. She has some amazing insights about the social changes that followed the Black Death and what they can teach us about the current crisis. So please do join us then. Beyond COVID is part of the Real Agenda Network and brought to you by Compassion in Politics.